Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on what do developers think of threat modeling. Thank you very much for joining us. We have a great group of panelists today. My name's Altaz Villani. I work at Security Compass, and I think right out of the gate, why don't we introduce who our panelists are? So just going across my screen, Sam, if you can introduce yourself.
Thank you, Altaz. So my name is Sam Segal. I lead the program for DevSecOps at Dell Technologies, which is hosted by the security organization. I'm also a co-chair for DevSecOps working group at Cloud Security Alliance, and I'm also a co-author as well as an author at LinkedIn Learning Programs.
Wonderful. Nice to have you with us. And Danny, you want to introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, thank you, Altus. I'm Danny Katzman. I currently run a team of developers working on identity and access management solutions. I've worked with Altus and with Paul on the IEEE DevOps standard. Yeah, glad to be here.
Fabulous. Yeah, nice to have you. And Paul, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah. Hi, my name's Paul. I am the head of incubation at a company called Tricentis. I run a small team of devs that work really hard to figure out what the next thing we want to do is, and spike and prototype and stuff. I also worked on the standard with Altaz and Danny and a whole bunch of other people, so I get exposed to wider areas of thinking, including security, threat modeling, and those kind of things, while working with those colleagues.
That's wonderful.
I also ran organized DevSecOps days, Boston last year. So yeah.
Well done. Cool. So thanks, everyone. Again, please make this a community effort. If you've got comments, if you've got questions, put them in. Let's see if we can run our way through these things. We only have 1 hour, and we've got a significant topic that we want to take on, which is all about the intersection of threat modeling and developers. So jumping right out of the gate, the first question I'd like to pop to the panelists is, what is threat modeling? Right. And I'm not talking about threat modeling in the sense of we're going to try to identify threats in order to derive mitigations. And, that's very security speak. We should really try to talk about threat modeling from the perspective of requirements, testing, in the DevOps tool chain, like that type of thing. How would you explain what threat modeling is to people who are in that development space? I know, Sam, you've been doing some things in the past where you've created programs. I'll start with you, and then I'll flip over to Paul, and then we'll go to Danny to offer some thoughts on just defining threat modeling in a way that makes sense to a developer.
Yeah, so speaking to a developer, your goal is to write a software that is not only functional, but also secure. Now, to achieve these goals, typically would start with a design or architecture effort in the beginning of your life cycle. So threat modeling is the art and science of analyzing in advance the system you're going to build so you can understand the security characteristics. And it allows you actually to achieve three goals. First of all, you may be having a security requirement or a set of security requirements. It allows you to find out early on if you have any design flaws that will stop you from meeting those security requirements. Number two, it allows you to foresee any weaknesses that might eventually crop up in your software that may lead to a software breach. Obviously, you don't want to do that. And lastly, it gives you a path, not the solution, but a path to understanding and addressing those flaws and those weaknesses and how you can go about addressing them, either at the design stage or when you write the code. So that's a quick overview for the developers on threat modeling.
Interesting. Paul, you want to offer your thoughts as well on trying to approach developers?
Sure. So I'll throw a couple A words at you. Threat modeling includes the consideration of which attack vectors to assets, right, are causing unwanted access by attackers. That's a lot of A words. So attack vectors, unwanted access to assets by attackers. But all these things are always within the context of the systems that are already in place, your apps, your services, and by the way, your pipelines. a lot of talk around supply chain attacks these days. Also, your organization, when policies are in place and within the context of your day-to-day work. So I've been developing software arguably since I was probably around 13, and the whole career just laid out. So I've been in hands deep in code for a long time. And in the day-to-day work, it's not always easy when you're really focused on trying to get something done, get a feature out there, get a new API endpoint spec'd out and ready to go, to also pause and think, wait, what have I not thought about, right? So you always need to be asking about what is the right approach, what's the right posture, and what's the right timing to put in place the appropriate mechanisms to make sure that these things aren't having to ask that same question every single time, like the old days of definition of done. A lot of it should be layered into pipeline, but it shouldn't be a no thought situation. We should consciously have at least a small checklist to say, have I thought about where the attack vectors might be to this new situation, or what the attack vectors might be to this new API endpoint. Hope that helps.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. So we've heard so far about the ability to go in there and analyze your system as a part of your software development practice. So threat modeling takes a look at it from a stability standpoint, and then you talked about repeatability as well, Paul. If I could kind of tease out some of what you'd said, I'd like to hear, Danny, from your perspective, how do you explain threat modeling to a developer?
So threat modeling, the way I see it, is taking an holistic view as a team, not only as a developer, with the whole team that's in charge of the security, and that should be made up of all the people, all the different stakeholders across the line until the software gets deployed, and create some sort of holistic view that you can always reference and see, okay, have I changed something? Even if I'm changing in one area, is it affecting somewhere else? Am I opening up a vulnerability? And obviously have those monitoring and observability tools that can inform me immediately if I've missed something and rectify it sooner than later.
Yeah, so you bring up an interesting point here, Danny. If you look at observability, so we'll go in and we'll essentially derive and instrument the ability to go in there and extract information from a bunch of different areas in the architecture itself. And so threat modeling really can fit in to a natural part of what do we do with the information that we're observing now. Are we finding certain patterns? Are there certain things? Traditionally, we've looked at it from the perspective of scalability, and things like that. But now it also is looking at it from the perspective of, could something here go wrong? Could somebody try and use our system in a way that was unintended? And let me just kind of share something here. This is some research that we did, and looking at the ratio of security teams and development teams, we found that in most cases the ratio is 1 to 50, and then in some cases it even goes as high as 1 to 100. And yet at the same time, we're trying to help developers understand threat modeling, which was historically perceived as a security activity. So we've got this problem here where we don't have enough people on the security side, but yet at the same time, we want developers to embrace what threat modeling is. And Danny, since you brought up this whole idea of architecture, I'd like you to offer your thoughts based on your experience. If a developer comes in, assume I'm a developer and I come in and it's like, well, threat modeling should be something that security teams should be doing. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's education, education, education. That's the bottom line. It's empowering your developers to be able to give that perspective and look at it with a more critical eye, and coming back to the DevOps methodology, don't throw it over the wall. It's in your court and you're part of that process, and going back, and it's education.
Mm-hmm. And Sam, do you have thoughts on how you've been able to operationalize this, right? As we start to get developers looking at threat modeling, what is it? Because they deal with Git and they deal with, Jenkins and all these types of things. But, threat modeling tools are kind of a foreign concept here. So Danny's talking about the training capabilities. And can you talk a little bit from your experience, what you've seen?
Yeah, so I think So threat modeling in the landscape of software design and security aspects has a very unique properties. It's not something that you can automate in a pipeline. You can codify through some script and code. It is something like you said, and Danny said earlier. It's something that needs to be manually ingrained in the mindset and habits of the developers. So I think we all understand that. So the question here is, how do we approach and how do we reach the scale? So obviously the one part is teaching them, quote unquote, how to fish. And instead of feeding them, doing it for the developers. So usually security teams would have a security champions program. They would have a very strong training program. And then sitting together with the development teams, especially with their architects, and going through this exercise maybe once or twice so that the development teams can get a full handle on what is it like to do threat modeling, what is it like to think about the unknowns. So I think having that mindset of a security person without being a security person as a label, I think that will be a good starting point for the teams who are trying to scale threat modeling.
And I do hear that, like it's a mindset thing. It's in some cases the sort of the phrase, an attacker's mindset is being used to help train, and we'll sort of unpack how we might be able to do this. But I want to give Paul a chance as well. I mean, Paul, you've been knee deep in some stuff on the SRE side. You've been looking at all this. Like, how do you begin to get security into the developer consciousness here?
Repeatable and scalable. Not necessarily to Sam's point, not necessarily automatable. But like in the SRE world, I have it on good faith that there's a number of devs watching this. Okay, hi devs. We are devs together for a second. How many of us feel like we have enough subject matter expertise? Sure, on security. How about performance and scalability? SREs. You feel like you have enough SREs on your team? Probably not. So there's always a question of back to the how do we scale this out? When somebody puts training on your calendar, I mean, when there's required training, that's one thing. But when there's optional training, that's your opportunity to do three things. And this is my implore to you from being more than 20 plus years a dev, is that personal curiosity. I mean, I'll start with what I'd like it to be about, right? I am a curious person. Curiosity, measured curiosity has helped me figure out what I want to do and how to grow as a person and as a professional, right? It enriches your own mindset, stretches you a little. But if that's not enough, how about your career? How about the fact that if you know a little bit more about a slightly different arena, not only can you interact with those people a little better, but you can also potentially put some of that stuff in your portfolio and have a good career path. The more diverse the skills, also, cha-ching, potentially the more money. So there's two reasons why this should be something that you're willing to take at least an hour or two of training and potentially work into your day-to-day mindset. But the third one is, at the very worst, CYA, cover your butt, right? Like knowing what not to step in and who and when to get the right people involved. And just think, develop a relationship with some of the people, a positive relationship with some of the people in the security practice at your organization, if there's such a thing. And especially at the higher levels, there certainly are, to get a sense for, hey, when should I pull you in? And how can I learn so that I don't have to pull you in over and over again about the same stuff, right? That goes a long way to developing relationships and trust, such that by the time your thing has to go through a proper security review, they know you, right? They know that there's somebody caring, at least, and maybe encouraging caring in the team that is about to ship this thing. So, yeah.
So if I hear you correctly, then, so you're suggesting, Paul, that looking at threat modeling is in fact going to make you a better developer. Did I hear that correctly?
Sure. Why not? I mean, gardening makes me a better developer. I come from a testing background. Testability, building testable systems is not always easy, right, by default. But then being able to flip the lens and say, if I was to hand this downstream and it's wholly untestable, what I'm doing to my organization is setting them up with a dependency for a complicated thing. Always makes it very tricky to figure out if it's going to work or not. So, some of the yes, learning and exploration of various different concepts. Some of the best devs and dev advocates that I know didn't start because their mommy or daddy were programmers and their grandparents were programmers. They took a degree in like drama, or they did, and then they pivoted into, hey, this isn't that terribly difficult. And by the way, in a good situation, your employer should be putting education and training in place. They shouldn't just expect that people are experts by default. So yes, I mean, it will. Exploration and curiosity are the core concepts I'm saying, and those will always make you a better engineer, a better developer. And threat modeling just happens to be something that is very pertinent, very useful, and very critical to when you're shipping software. So please be curious for a little while about it.
Yeah. Some devs might want just to even understand, are there certain rules around threat modeling or things like that? And I think there is there's a site out there. It's a threat modeling manifesto. Have a look at it. There were some industry practitioners, folks that got together and they put together, even people from academia, and they kind of put together a list of things, and that could be a starting point. What is this all about? And I'd like to drill a little bit deeper on your comment, Paul, about the fact that doing threat modeling gives you the diversity and perspective so that it will make you a better developer. Danny, agree, disagree?
I definitely agree, and I think most developers that enjoy what they're doing and they're not doing it because they're forced to do it are always critically thinking about the system, how to make it better. Maybe they're not calling it threat modeling, but they critically thinking about the system, how to make it better. And if we give them some sort of guidelines of extra areas where they could add to that critical thinking, it would definitely make them better developers.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we've started to get some questions coming in from our various channels here. So let's pick these off one at a time. First one out of the gate: is there a specific guideline on levels of threat modeling and the scope of the components to be included in threat modeling? Sam, you want to take this? You've looked at it from a program perspective. How do you scope this, and how do you start to create some prioritization on this levels of threat modeling? How does that work?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question, because when you start to look at a complex system and you want to approach threat modeling, you always feel, as a developer, as an architect, you feel challenged. Where do I start? It's so complex. There are so many interconnections. So think of this as peeling layers of an onion. You start with a overarching architecture that has certain inputs and outputs, and you look at the trust boundaries, you look at the data flow, and then you see what could go wrong in that high level system. But then dig deeper, look at what are the subcomponents, what are the subsystems that are making part of the bigger system. And then you may not even have the expertise. For example, if you're building a comprehensive large scale e-commerce platform, you'll have part of that as a checkout, part of that being the buyer experience, part of that being the inventory and warehouse interaction. So you may not even have the expertise. But I think if you work collaboratively with the architecture of individual components and systems or subsystems, you can actually break it down and have an understanding of what could go wrong at an overall system level and what could go wrong at individual subsystem level. So try to break it down in logical and technical components and work with their individual SMEs and experts to break it down and then tackle it from there. Otherwise, it can get too cumbersome and comprehensive for one person to handle.
Yeah, so this to me sounds like a sprint zero activity, right? Let's make sure we've got the right people in there to help us prioritize some of this stuff.
If I could just add to that.
Yeah. Danny, go ahead.
I think there's a huge difference with the scope of if I'm creating a website to memorialize all my late grandmother's recipes as opposed to writing a banking website. The scope of the threat modeling will be completely different, and I think it's a very individual case by case on what the scope should be.
How do you determine that scope? What are the things that typically go into prioritization? Is it what's important to the business? Is it based on how many integrations? Like, what are some of the things you take a look at, Danny, when you look at threat modeling?
I mean, these days, the question isn't, am I going to be hacked? It's when I'm going to be hacked. So one of the first things to do is look at the industry that you're in and see what are the levels of attacks, percentage-wise, that comes towards that industry. And based on that, you can create some sort of an assumption of how much effort you have to put into it, and speak to the different stakeholders and have a roundtable discussion, speak to the business, speak to the security experts and the developers, and come up with a strategy. I think that's, each case has to be thought out individually.
Yeah, there's a contextual element to this as well. Paul, were you
Yeah.
trying to get a comment? Go ahead.
No, I'm excited about this because this is where it locks in, right? And I'm going to talk to the developers again. You know how the inside of the box works. You know what I mean? Like, like take an engine or some kind of box and you can't see inside it. Well, you can. And a generic approach to trying to set generalities around something maybe is a good step when you don't know what's on the inside of, you know, your project or your API or your black box. But you have that knowledge, you have that privilege about what's going on inside that you have to lend to that sprint zero phase one planning process to say, you know, as we're building this, I know what the potential issues will be. So let's put that in place rather than waiting for somebody outside the organization, an attacker, to actually find and exploit that. So like you have the privileged knowledge about how the thing works on the inside, or if you put just a little bit of those like you know, the metal filings in the wrong place in a particular geary wheelie machine will mess the whole thing up. You know where those places are better than, quite frankly, most of the other people in your organization. So you have to be in these conversations, please, for your own safety and for your organization and for your users and customers.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it goes to the earlier question as well. Is threat modeling just a security activity? The developers have, we've got the ability to take a look at this at the code level. We know how the stuff is put together. And it's less of an abstraction of the various systems that we've got trying to integrate together. So please, developers, get involved, learn about this activity, help us build systems that are going to become increasingly secure over time. Let's jump over to another question that also came in. One question I get all the time from devs is, why don't you automate threat modeling and just leave us alone? Right? So this whole idea. Okay, Paul, you're eager to jump in. Go for it.
I just finished 3 days. It was a 2-day conference, DevOps Day Boston. But I've been there for 3 days, loading in and loading out and doing and with a lot of other organizers. The conversation was the exact same thing. Could you just leave me alone and like let me do my other things? Because the pie chart of what is required from our dev day to day is already crowded. It's already like, why try to shove another thing in there? And the same thing came up with a lot of the SREs and DevOps professionals and practitioners at this conference yesterday and Monday, was the devs who are just like, I don't know or care how the pipeline works. I barely care to package up my application and put it in a container so that I can hand it to you and you do the Kubernetes stuff. That's all I care about, really. I just want to build the app, right? And I don't want to know about this other stuff. You have to know about this other stuff because the app lives and operates across the whole thing. Do you have to be an expert? Do you have to be the one that's doing all the things? No, but it's incredibly helpful to know those things. And the reverse, that statement that says, not my job, not my problem, that's bull crap. Like, don't do that. Please don't do that to your colleagues. Don't do that to yourself, and don't do that to your organization. But also know that just because you don't know something and you know more about it now doesn't mean you have to be the one that's doing it. You don't have to accept extra work just because, right? Just let's figure this out together. Have conversations with your team to say, look, I can know that this is important for me, but who's going to do this on a regular basis? How are we going to scale this out? Putting those questions back to your colleagues really helps to prevent you from taking on all the new work and that pie chart getting impossibly big for yourself.
So if I may add, Altas, to this point, I think it goes back to the concept of ownership, which is very well ingrained in DevOps and DevSecOps. If I'm a developer, yes, I am responsible for my application, but I'm also responsible for the performance and security of my application as well. And if my piece of Lego that fits in this entire ecosystem has somehow it doesn't fit there or somehow makes the entire structure weaker, it's my responsibility, it's my ownership to fix it. Threat modeling is a tool to help you understand that better. It's not a chore that you gotta do. It's actually helping you do your job slightly better than you could have done without threat modeling.
100%. 100%.
And I think now even more that a lot of developers are moving into also developing the infrastructure as code piece of their application. The level of threat modeling as to from the developer's point of view, because a majority of the developers that I know have got no idea about firewalls and IPs and things like that. And if you're bringing up this whole infrastructure and you can't think that critical thinking that you can think about how I'm securing my API in the code, it opens a whole new can of worms that
Yeah.
needs
Yeah.
to
So
be dealt with.
there's an increasingly more important role that developers can play when it comes to threat modeling. I think the general consensus is that there is a nuance that developers bring in, the deeper understanding of the systems. But in order to make this work, it has to be collaborative, right? It's like I get it. You've got things you need to do. You've got to release quickly. We've got data on just when things get released, and it's frequent. To some companies, do it less frequent, but at the same time, there's pressure to get things out. Don't neglect that threat modeling is another tool in your toolbox that you can put in. Let's just quickly move on. We've got a lot of questions coming in here. What are the different characteristics of effective automated threat modeling? Interesting. Anyone thought about this? Different characteristics of effective automated threat modeling. What parts of threat modeling could be automated? Right. I'll chime in and I'll offer some thoughts, and let's see if the rest of you might have some thoughts around this. Usually, when I have conversations on the developer side, what's the intake to the pipeline has to do with requirements. Are there things we can do to help us efficiently generate those requirements? If you say every time we develop a system or a subcomponent of a system or something like that, we need to get the same people around the table, do the same activities, and come up with the same results again, that to me, from a value stream standpoint, is there's some wasted time there. So can we get lean with some of this? If we've done this in another similar kind of component, could we not leverage that and say, you know what, the architecture on that is very similar to the architecture we're dealing with here, and these were our findings, and so at least out of the gate, at a minimum, we should be considering the following things. Now, there are nuances. There will be additional things that may be different and all that, no problem. But for example, let me give you a concrete thing. Like if you're dealing with databases, and you've got a certain kind of system where that it needs to be secure, data at rest needs to be encrypted, irrespective of the database, irrespective of the systems you've got. So in that sense, at least we've got a requirement that says when we're putting stuff in, we need to encrypt it. Now, you can encrypt it based on many different criteria. You can encrypt the row, you can encrypt the data in that field itself. And these are all nuances that can emerge. But it's that kind of thinking. Like we could, at some level, automate at least the generation of the requirements, and maybe even look at some of the test scripts that we've done to see and verify that we've done this kind of stuff in the past. But the analysis part of it, where we have to go through and dig and find out who are the actors that we think might come in, where might this go wrong, how might someone use this unintentionally, those nuances I think are very difficult to automate. But I welcome people to come in and disagree with me on this. So across the panel, does anyone have any thoughts on what we might be able to automate when it comes to threat modeling?
I mean, can we automate people's thinking? Threat modeling, as you said, is an assessment. We're coming in and we're assessing. Okay, so if we say we've got a database or we've got a firewall or anything we have, so we can apply previous solutions that we've automated. Obviously, all the problems we find in the threat modeling analysis, the solutions should be automated. They have to be automated to allow you and added to your pipelines. And if you're writing specific code, then you have static code analysis, you have the QA testing, you have or penetration testing. That also be part of the automated pipeline. But coming up with the requirements, I mean, when you write a system, can you automate coming up with the requirements?
If you've got a system that's got similar architectural constraints, could you not do something like that? Would that help?
You can use
determination. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
You can use templates that at least start the conversation in a right direction.
Yep.
Doesn't mean you don't have to think about it, and that's the concern. Is
That's a good point.
I don't know about you, but there are some people in the software business that do not think all the time. So I mean, like, you're still required to think, but the busy work like SREs and DevOps engineers will help to build patterns and pipeline templates and stuff like that for various different clouds and stacks and stuff. And if you're large enough of a company where you have the luxury of doing that and build that out, but even if you're not, right, like a team that's already gone before, right, has done this before. Can we learn from them? And that requires collaboration between, even in a small organization, teams, and especially in large ones. But I think the automation should not be about the thinking or the diagnosis or the final decision point, right? This is where I deviate from some of my other DevOps and SRE colleagues, is this, I don't think that continuous deployment is mostly a right fit for most people, because there's still plenty of reasons why you have to take a human decision to say, now is the time. Continuous delivery is a different thing. So can we automate signals? Can we automate getting rid of the noise ratio compared to the signal? Yes. But ultimately taking a decision, both in the planning process and getting the right, your survey said that there was a high degree of people who said acceptance criteria would be nice, diagrams would be useful in the planning process, helping to identify what the acceptance criteria, and then reverse engineer how you get to a more easy answer to, yes, this is good enough. You have to have information in place. You have to have the right signals in place. And you have to be willing to accept the continuous improvement on what signals help us faster and more meaningfully get to a faster, good, confident decision, right? So that there is tons of stuff that you can automate, but it's mostly the feedback loops, and getting the right feedback loops in place with the right teams, with the right timing, does take right fitting, and that's a human thing. We are human.
Interesting. So there's again, questions just keep coming in here. Hang tight. So let's jump into another one here. Will doing a DAST, so we've got SaaS DAST, within the pipeline. Will doing DAST help in identifying the potential issues just before moving the application into production? So the question here is the connection between threat modeling and DAST. So is DAST something that I could use to help to identify some of these issues? Sam, have you, in your experience when dealing with, creating a program that includes the devs, have you had to deal with something like this where the tool, there's a specific tool that already exists and maybe that's good enough? Have you had to face that?
Actually, yes. I'm going to color this question a bit more. If somebody might say, well, we are already doing pen testing before our release or once or twice a year. Why do threat modeling? So think of this as a cost of doing a particular security activity. The rightmost you are in the development lifecycle, the more expensive that activity becomes, because the cost of finding the issue and addressing it more expensive. DAST is typically performed, or even pen testing or SAST, when you do have either the existence of a piece of code, or you have an application that is deployed in a staging environment. And if you find an issue, and if you can fix the issue correctly in the code, that's fine, that's good. But think about this. If you could have found that particular problem or a similar problem early on, would have been much cheaper and much more effective to solve. So threat modeling doesn't replace DAST. They actually supplement each other. You just do threat modeling early on, and it's much less expensive to do and find and address an issue at that time.
Yeah. So now we start to get into different tools, and I think one of the things that I've seen in the past is if you try to get a tool to do something that it was not intended for. So, for example, I've heard a similar comment come out when it comes to SAST, like static analysis. Can we not catch some of the stuff when doing static analysis? Static analysis is something that's useful from a code perspective, to analyze the code, to look for potential security issues in the code itself. Will it catch everything for you? Going back to the layered approach that we were talking about, there are certain things around architecture that a SAST scan may not catch, for example. And I think this is what you're kind of bringing out, Sam. There are certain tools that are useful, and collectively working together, this is what helps us. But developers have that role to play in helping to identify what might be some of these security concerns, to Paul's earlier point, because you have a nuanced approach to the code that frankly nobody else does, right? And let me just bring out some of the comments that are still coming in as well. There was one comment: with equal participants of my product architects and developers, I was able to complete around 20 threat models, I guess, for different products recently. I delivered a tailor-made approach for our organization. So to the comment earlier that this has to be something specific to an organization, depending on your context, and then the way that they did it was they had the right amount of people, the right mix of people around the table to move forward. I would love to hear more if this individual would like to offer some additional comments on what worked, what didn't work, and we can share that with others as well. There was also another comment that came in around automation. Review the responses for threats identified can be automated through CI/CD. Some documentation can be automated. So this goes back to the threat identification, which is the feedback loop that you were talking about, Paul. Right? If you identify the threats, maybe in a SecOps, from that standpoint, you could go in. Documentation could be updated. It could be brought back in to say this is now what we need to do. But also, when we look at it from a left perspective, how do we go in and identify the threats early on, to what Sam was talking about, to ensure that we don't go too far before we have to now suddenly we've got this threat that we didn't consider. Again, it will never be perfect. This is an ongoing process. But let me open that up a little bit. This idea of automating the documentation. Any thoughts from anyone in the panel around this?
So I can add a little bit color to it. So if you think about automation, there are a lot of research and in academia, well, what can be automated. And typically what they say is that if a process can be broken down into small chunks, and either the process or the software are repeatable, that task should be and typically will be automated. Anything that doesn't fit into this paradigm is usually very hard to automate. So threat modeling, I think we have been talking about this, has this portion of creativity, brainstorming, but then it also has the portion of workflows. What do you do with the threats that were identified? How do you make sure that developer actually goes and addresses them? So I think the part of that which is more like a workflow centric, which is documentation, putting some stories in Jira, can be automated, but the creativity or the innovation around that and the analysis cannot, as in my opinion, automated very well.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts from others regarding automation, documentation?
Yeah, quick one.
Paul?
So
Yeah.
remember our other colleague from the IEEE 2675 DevOps standard, Robert Carter, Dr. Carter. So he was the first one to introduce the phrase "write once, read never," and in the context of retros. So you sit there, you have a problem, you have an incident, and then you do a retro, and everybody gets to say, and then nothing ever happens. I mean, maybe you get some actions from one or two. No. Why even bother doing that if there's not going to be at least some things that we put into practice later on? That is. People say, if you're not failing, you're not learning. That's bullcrap too, because most people fail and they don't learn from their failures and their mistakes. It takes volition, it takes effort to take information and turn it into learning, and then learning into true action that produces a better path. So when it comes to, I know, Tricentis is part of the venture capital firm, and also Deep Factor. Deep Factor is one of those teams in the platform that actually show you a dynamic. It's embedded into your Linux kernels and into Kubernetes and stuff, and it will show you real time what's going on in your operational systems right? And how you comply or what doesn't. It doesn't necessarily prevent traffic from happening, but it's very real time. So to be able to have an information radiator, speaking of DevOps stuff, right, that at least the team can look at and go, how compliant are we after this release or before this release in a pre-production environment? It depends on people looking. It depends on people actually paying attention to the numbers. Same thing with performance. If you just write on the sprint board, like as if everybody's still in the office again, the sprint board, how much degraded your performance is every single day. If that one person that cares a lot about performance just walks by and updates the number, then when you do your stand-ups, people are like, why is the number so red? You don't know about the number unless it's visible. And some of this stuff should be made visible. It should be part of the review, the stand-up, the daily review, if anything. Thresholds matter. So
Yeah, making it a key part of the retros and bringing it and then actioning it out as well. Not just, yeah, this is great. And this has been part of the problem, right? The remediation cycle hasn't really been what we would like it to be in many cases, not always, but this is part of the problem. How do we look at these sort of pipelines that are releasing really quickly and start to inject things in? And again, there are techniques that can be used around this, but and we can get to that. Hold that thought. I hope we will have time in today's webinar to do that. But let's ask. There's another question that sort of came in. And the question is the following. I'd like to ask, is there a learning path for a web developer? So as a web developer, a learning path to get into web application security. I know there are some certifications for cloud security. Is that the path to take? So Danny, I'm going to pick on you and then I'll go to Sam after this, but learning path to bring a developer from that web developer mindset to start to move down the path of security. Is there a learning path to get them to that stage? Maybe eventually becoming a security champion or something like that. Can you offer any thoughts, Danny?
I think, as Paul said before, it all starts with curiosity. I mean, personally, I would send developers, just read the basics, look at OWASP, see what they're saying. Look at there's no defined learning path. You learn on the job. As far as I know, go to these events, be curious, and the more you learn, the more you understand how bigger and vast the world of security is, and if you're still curious, you can just amass that knowledge and information.
Yeah.
And
so you go in. Yeah. Go ahead.
And read reports of other companies that have been hacked, that have been breached. See what went wrong. See what you can take from there and implement in your own organization. And just make. No one's going to hand this to you on a gold platter. This is such a dynamic world. The security things are changing, I would say, hourly, with the different attack vectors and the possibilities and the new technologies that are coming out.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to flip over to Sam. Sam, can you offer some thoughts for someone who's looking to make the jump from web dev to web app security?
Yeah, I think I have two recommendations, and one is actually going to be a repeat of what Danny said. It's understanding what can go wrong, and obviously you can only, in your imagination, you can only go so far. So I would suggest learning about what are the most recent attacks and studying an analysis of what went wrong and how this could have been prevented. That would be the first. So think of those as case studies, and case studies can give you a lot of insights about a situational problem. The second would be, once you know about those areas, then you can start to look at some material, some content, or the YouTube or videos from OWASP. SANS offers some trainings, and then LinkedIn Learning also has multiple programs that offer details on all of these areas. So I would say focus on some of the case studies, and then jump into these a few resources out there.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that as well. There are podcasts, right? It doesn't cost anything. Go in there. I mean, SANS, you mentioned SANS, and that's what kind of triggered it in my mind. I mean, they put out, some great material. They talk about, what's out there, the threats, what's happening, and you can dig a little bit deeper then to the point that was made earlier. If you're curious, dig into it, find out what happened. And as you go through this, I think it's also important to look at it from the perspective that threat modeling is based on just gradually just accumulating that experience, and you just participate in doing this, and you use that in your day-to-day work. Hey, I read about this here. we should probably consider this here. And that in turn will get you on the journey to help you move forward. Paul, you've been doing a bunch of stuff, right? You're leading DevSecOps Days Boston. Like, talk about this stuff. Are there things that people can come take a look at? Please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, in part, one of the reasons I do conferences is because it is a scalable pattern. Though it takes a lot of effort and energy on my part and on a lot of other people's part who help with that. It's at least some way to say we are consolidating information in order to share it, right? And at a point in time, and then year over year or month over month or whatever, you're able to produce a meaningful body of work that lives and exists there for not just you and the few people who attended that moment, but for almost all of time. Not that all learning is useful for all of time, but like, at least it's a record of this is something out there, and you can go self-serve and listen to that. You can listen to that in your earbud while you're on your commute, in the RTOs that people are putting in place. But the point of attend conferences. And if your organization does not have budget for you to attend conferences, I mean, the DevOps Days stuff the past couple of days, my company I'm working with now, TriSentis, has like volunteer days, and so I'm able to use those. That's the encouragement to go do something meaningful, and also training budget. If they're not giving people the opportunity to improve and learn and put that security mindset in place, i.e. with threat modeling training courses, and to that point of learning path, then why would they ever expect not to have attacks and incidents? So the company should invest in you, right? And so I would suggest, being somebody who is kind of biased to the idea of conferences are still a useful thing to collect people and have fun and enjoy and learn together, look for conferences, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of stuff still virtual. Just watch out for vendors. I mean, like, everybody has something to sell, so just consider that, like, take knowledge from many different places, and be willing to spit out the seeds. You know what I mean? Eat the tomato, maybe spit out some of the seeds.
Mm-hmm.
So
let me pop a question. If I may add one more point to that. So putting yourself in the company of people who are from security background. So one of the things, like the conferences that Paul mentioned, but you can also participate in Cloud Security Alliance, DevSecOps, or Safe Code organization. You may not contribute in the beginning, but at least listening into the conversation will actually give you some food for thought and what you can do differently. So another idea for learning.
And if you find any speakers at these conferences that you like, majority of them are on Twitter. Follow them, see what they release thoughts about things that are happening, new things, threats that are coming out, and you can just whet your appetite. And every time, even if you've got 5 minutes waiting for the bus or wherever it is, read Twitter, follow interesting people in this domain, and you will learn a lot from experience.
Yeah, they're people. People are, like, they're human beings too. And the worst thing that can happen, like, ask without fear. Connect with people without fear. And you know what? I've never heard once of somebody saying, "I don't have time for you," explicitly. They might be so busy they miss your message, but don't take that as a negative, right? If you don't ask, you'll never know. So
yeah, get involved. It is a community effort. We're all trying to help make our products, software more secure. Here's another question that popped in. Is there a way to assess the effectiveness of our threat modeling? For instance, does it make sense to confront threat modeling from a forecasting standpoint with pen tests and results and facts? So in other words, we've got threat modeling that we're doing. Can we assess how effective it is insofar as, hey, our pen tests, the results from our pen tests are turning out to be much cleaner than what we used to have in the past. So that's a value that threat modeling can provide. Any thoughts on that? The connection between the threat modeling and assessing the effectiveness of threat modeling in some downstream activities. Anyone have thoughts on that?
Actually, this is one of my favorite questions of all the questions today. So we have a phrase in our company that if we are doing secure development lifecycle correctly, then technically we shouldn't be finding ourselves, any issues later on, and we should be putting ourselves out of jobs. That should be our goal. but that never happens. So what that means to this, going back to this question is, all of these activities that we perform, whether it's static code analysis, dynamic scan, or threat modeling, their goal is to identify issues up front. But some things will slip through the path and eventually end up somewhere later downstream. So that's why we have something called root cause analysis. If we are finding more issues through, let's say, pen testing or through a bug bounty program, or worst case in the deployed products, we need to understand. Now, we don't need to sort of mock this or kind of pinpoint fingers, but do a proper retro and a root cause analysis. What could have we done differently? Was it because we missed a system to analyze, or was it because we didn't do a thorough job of understanding the weaknesses in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on the effectiveness of threat modeling with downstream activities? One of the things that I've heard as well is when I talk to developers, having been a developer myself as well, I want some really good, clean requirements, right? If something is ambiguous, then it becomes difficult for me to interpret what I'm supposed to do with this. And I think some of the Sprint Zero activities we talked about earlier can help to clarify a bit of that. But when we conduct a threat model, sometimes as a developer, my question would be, why are we doing this exactly? So there's a defensibility aspect to this as well. And the effectiveness of threat modeling insofar as being able to generate a defensible security requirement, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it opens up my eyes to think now, oh, hey, hold on a second. If that's the case, then there may be 2 or 3 other places that we might want to consider this as well. And so that gets into the queue and we can prioritize accordingly. And that's the kind of value that bringing in the developer mindset can help, right? The threat modeling activity is there. It adds value insofar as its ability to generate some additional requirements that maybe we need to consider that we haven't thought about before. But I'll just drop that in there. Anyone else have any other thoughts or comments on the effectiveness of threat modeling with downstream activities? Could be upstream activities too, right? But that's a separate conversation, compliance and things like that.
I mean, one of the most simplest things that you can come up with threat modeling is rate limiting based on IP address.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you will write in code that you'll have a cache and you will decide based on how many calls you're getting how to react. But the reaction is only because you sat and created the model. So majority of the remediation of those threat models should be automated.
Yeah.
There's some comments coming in from YouTube. Threat modeling keeps getting refined every time we do it for the same product. It gets simpler as we mature. Many of the earlier threat models can be used as reusable components for new releases. The short is, thank you for those comments. The short is it takes time to learn, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it takes effort to learn. And upstream and downstream, the active and important thing, actually recently from some of our incubation thinking and work and portfolio planning, upstream and downstream, most people think about that within the context of time. Upstream is before downstream. No, the most important aspect that I've started to think about when it comes to upstream and downstream is dependency. What is dependency chain? Because the downstream, the downstream of downstream is another cycle, which is the upstream, which is the planning process for the next thing. So the dependency that goes in between those things, if you don't have a dependency of a quick feedback loop saying when we move something into operation within a short enough period of time, we will conduct a synthesis of the information we're learning, and if there's any important things to put in the next planning process, so we're not tripping over our shoelaces with problems that only show up a month later while we're trying to do the next major release train or something like that. That closeness of feedback loop, there should be in place.
Yeah, makes sense. Sorry, go ahead, Paul. Go ahead. Wrap up your thought.
A maturity model that includes a requirement for the feedback loop, right?
Yeah. So I just we've got at least a dozen or two additional questions we can ask, and I want to try and sneak one in just at the last moment here for this webinar. And coming in as a developer, okay, so we've talked about threat modeling. Does this now mean that I've got to learn some new tool, and I've got to, it's like, oh no, I've got my code editor. This is what I do. Talk to me. Is this some new tool? Is there something that now is going to disrupt how I do things? How would you respond to that kind of a comment when it comes in? Thoughts?
If you consider a whiteboard a new tool, then yes, you need a new tool.
Yep, a threat model could be done on a whiteboard. Yeah, it could be done. We talk a lot of times about data flow diagrams, but it could be, we're used to use cases. Flip it on its head. Talk about misuse cases. Where might something, be misused, and start to go down that path. It doesn't need to be a tool. You could use a tool. There are some fine tools out there. There are some things that people can use, organizations can use, teams can use. But we shouldn't get tied up on the fact that there's got to be a tool around this in some way, right? To Paul's point earlier, if we are able to derive the communication and the explanation, which has an exploratory component to this, an analysis component to this, this is where the value is going to come in. Sam, I'd like to kind of pick your brain on this. When you talk about developing these sort of tool chains with the stuff that fits in, you're now starting to enter into discussions at scale. When you look at threat modeling, do you find as well in your experience that the maturity tends to go from something that may be just an informal discussion, but it helps us drive what we need to focus on, to then getting into a tool, to eventually getting to a knowledge base? Is that the case? Or, can you use discussions all the way through maturity levels? Talk about some of your DevOps work that you've done and what's been your experience. And I think others could benefit from that as well.
Yeah, so again, it goes back to the comment I made earlier. The part of threat modeling activity has certain portions that are very much like things that needs to be done over and over again. I think as teams have already tackled their automated code scanning, code coverage, security testing, I think now there is an open space for industry in general and for all of us to address how can we better integrate the outcomes or outputs of the threat modeling exercise into the same pipeline. So, for example, one thought process that has been ongoing is as the pipeline runs or as a particular Git event takes place, why don't we actually go and sort of run those tests that were outputted by the threat modeling activity? Is there a way we can take the output and sort of be more focused on running those tests? And again, it goes back to what kind of application we are building. If we are building a credit card processing application, so there might be certain aspects of those verification activities that threat modeling will identify, and we'll hone in on that in the pipeline. So there, I see a marriage happening between the parts of threat modeling and then the automation pipeline. So I can only see this word getting more and more mature and automated.
Interesting. Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes left. 30 seconds for each one of you. Last thoughts, right? Go devs, go. Paul, your thoughts? Any advice you can give to devs out there?
Reach out to me. Reach out to Danny. Reach out to Sam. Reach out to Altaz. Reach out to people and have conversations. Right? Don't just sit on this webinar and then go away and be like, I did what I thought this is not enough. This is the beginning. Please continue the conversation. And we will figure out how to connect you with what you need to take the next steps of your journey and so on and so forth. That's my thought right there.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. Danny, last thoughts.
Just stay curious. Carry on coming to webinars. Start participating if you can in webinars yourself. It forces you to learn and be up to date, and it's great exposure. So just be part of the community. I think that's the biggest thing.
Sam?
So security is everyone's responsibility, including developers. So take ownership of the security and then use threat modeling as a tool, as an activity to help me make your products or software more secure.
That's great. Well, with that, then I just want to say thank you to everybody. We appreciate you taking the time to come into the webinar today. It's been helpful, hopefully, to what you're doing. Stay involved, be a part of a community. If you've got any questions, reach out. We're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn. please continue on the journey. Thank you so much once again. And with that, we'll just call it a day and have yourselves a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hal.